Right, it's a slow Sunday, isn't it? However, um, yeah, I did some tinkering this morning with Python bindings for treesitter, and yeah, it seems simple enough to get what I want, which is basically being able to plug treesitter in as a relatively straightforward way of extracting comments from generically from source code files. So as long as you've got a tree sitter parser available for the language, all you need to do is look for the comment blocks or the equivalent thereof using simple Redford search on the parse tree. So yeah, I think I've got to look at Sphinx and see how easy it is for the auto docs to be integrated. I can't see it being particularly difficult, and then I'll probably just knock together very rough and ready auto docs that does nothing clever at this point. All it will do is take whatever you put in comments with a particular leader and just put that into your document as restructured text, which will allow me then to basically do document extraction on things like bash scripts, for which there is currently no auto doc that I can find. And the same will apply for any other language that I fancy doing it for. I'm not going to bother doing anything complicated like figuring out, how to get function signatures and things like that at the moment. All I'm interested in is just doing a very simple comment extraction. That'll be enough. Right, so there's that. The other thing I've done is, on the back of that actually, I had a play with ChatGPT. And here are my thoughts, such as they are. That was me playing, by the way. This was basically the outcome of all of the different ways that I tried to do the tree sitter stuff. It's not rocket science, any of it. I ended up with this, basically this function to just do the extract of the comments with a very simple tree walk. Yeah. Right. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, ChatGPT. Yeah, just out of curiosity, I actually went to ChatGPT. Well, I say went to. I registered and blah blah blah. And I just asked GPT to write a Python script to. What was it? Write a script in Python to extract comments using the tree sitter. And the first answer it gave me was basically shit. It just was completely non-functional. And in actual fact, the very first sentence said, "I can't write you a script, but here's an example." And it then promptly went on to give me a Python example, which was good Python. It just didn't have the API for treesitter at all right. And then afterwards, it said, "This script is an example, blah blah blah." And I was like, "Well, hang on a minute. If you can't write me a script," and of course, I think what it had done is it had read the sentence initially as being a script, as in a script for a play or a script for a movie. And I think that's where it had got itself confused in the first sentence. However, not one to give up, I simply allowed it to have a second go And the second one was closer. It still had got the API wrong, but it was certainly closer than the first attempt. And then I regenerated it a third time, and this time it did at least, it basically came up with that extract comments function, more or less. It still wasn't quite right, but with what I had already learned about treesitter, plus, that very, on the face of it, a very obvious function, it did the job. So, yeah, I certainly wouldn't trust it to write any substantial code. But I then went on and asked it a few historical questions. And although the answers were by no means comprehensive, they were at least sensible. So I think, let me see, what did I say? Oh yeah, the first thing I did was it said, sorry, what were the reasons for the Afghan war? And it went on and explained about, terrorist attacks, blah, blah, blah. Then I said, what about the Russian-Afghan war? Because, of course, the Russians were in Afghanistan in the late 70s, early 80s. And it went on and discussed things like the Cold War and the reasons for them being in there. Then I said, what was it? Why did the US lose the Vietnam War? And it came up with a list of reasonable explanations. Things like, they had a very vague remit, so it was, it was a war without a real objective. It was a war in jungle and urban areas, for which the US Army wasn't really prepared, and the Viet Cong were very motivated to defend their country. Blah blah. Yeah, a fairly standard, high school analysis of the Vietnam War. So I thought, okay. I then said to it, describe the similarities between the Afghan conflict and the Vietnam conflict. And it did a pretty good job. Again, it extracted these commonalities, and it did a fairly good job of extracting the commonalities. So all in all, what I will say is it at least constructed, a few paragraphs that were cogent. They made sense. Not by any means a deep analysis, but as I say, I would say pretty much high school level results. And purely from a language processing point of view, I was very impressed. It does a very good job of analysing the question and actually coming up with a reasonably cogent answer. And the answers are well formed in that they are evidently native English. So yeah, I'm going to continue tinkering with it just out of amusement. I wouldn't advocate relying on it for anything substantial. I'm going to try challenging it with a few more esoteric questions. To do with technology, things like, construct a Helm chart to provide a I don't know, provide a PyTest for blah blah blah. So I'm going to try it with a few things just to see what it comes up with, and see how far I can push it in terms of how far on the boundaries of conceptual stuff it can deal with in IT, and throw a few more things at it. Literature, philosophy, history, and just see what kind of results I get. It's certainly interesting. One thing I will say is that, in common with other machine learning efforts, it seems to me that the primary reason for its success is the corpus with which it's trained, which is something we lacked back in the 80s when I was studying artificial intelligence, and we were doing all this machine learning stuff with neural networks. It wasn't quite what we do, what's done nowadays, but looking at the stuff that's done nowadays, I can certainly see that it came from the earlier stuff. The problem we had was the internet wasn't really a thing. Well, the internet was a thing, but not the World Wide Web. So the corpus of data that we had to work with was relatively small, and that was always the problem in training the models. There are only so many pictures of cats that you can get access to, unless you've got the internet, where you've got millions of verified pictures of cats of all sorts. So when you're training a vision model to try and recognize a cat or a dog or whatever, the one thing you need is thousands and thousands of images, verified images of the target. And even with having neural nets that were relatively primitive, the one thing you needed was a lot of training data. So yeah, it's interesting to see how machine learning has come along. Like I said, the models now are more sophisticated in the way that they're cleverer at like feature isolation and self-reinforcement and generative machine learning, stuff like that is a more advanced, certainly. I don't want to do a disservice, but like I said, most of it is recognizable from stuff we were studying back in the 80s. Actually, talking about stuff that we were doing back in the 80s, one of the things that has been amusing me recently has been all the hand-wringing going on about artificial intelligence and how people are like, oh, yes, we need to consider the ethical implications of self-driving cars. But, seriously, what was it? Late 80s? Yeah, mid to late 80s. We were talking about this stuff and saying that it was really important. We needed to get this shit sorted out because it was going to be a problem. And to be honest, we were in a relatively mature state then. This had started to be talked about in the late 50s or the mid to late 50s. I think Alan Turing had already sort of broached the issue back in the early 50s. But it was already something that had been talked about even in the 60s and 70s. And we were certainly studying it at university in the mid to late 80s. And this was something that people thought was going to be a very serious topic of discussion, politically and philosophically. And it has remained a topic of conversation in academia, and all the hand-wringing we're seeing now in the press is something. It's just so old hat. This is stuff that we've talked about endlessly. And it's a non-trivial problem, it has to be said. Where do you draw the line? Who is responsible? Who's culpable? Even apparently very simple things. If a system is genuinely self-learning or self-teaching, and is it able to reprogram, and I very carefully air quote that, reprogram itself. One assumes within boundaries that have been set by the developers, and certainly, boundaries will be set even so by the sensing equipment and so on. So there are all sorts of issues here. So there are design decisions by the developers which will influence what the system is capable of, even if it is self-learning. Capable of learning. But the question is, if you have a self-driving car, and that self-driving car, swerves into a queue of pedestrians and kills someone, the question is, who is liable? Is it the person who's occupying the driver's seat in the car, assuming there is one? Is it the person who owns the vehicle? Is it the team or the company who developed the vehicle and the artificial intelligence and the sensors? And there are many layers of culpability. Or is it the AI? Because can you make a machine learning system, no matter how sophisticated, unless you can say this thing is self-aware and conscious, something which in itself is a philosophical challenge. Can you hold it accountable for its actions or inactions? It's a tough one, and has been, technically and philosophically, not to mention legally. So, yeah, it just amuses me that these are old conversations that people are saying, oh, why haven't we been thinking? Well, we have been thinking about it for the last 50, 60 years. It's just that it's only now that people are becoming aware of the fact that these systems are capable of, taking actions that were not originally designed into the system explicitly. ChatGPT is a good example. You can argue that every time it answers a question, that question is, to all intents and purposes, unique. It's unique in the way it was phrased and who asked it and so on. And so its response is entirely novel. It's not a response that was built into the system from day one, in any way, shape, or form. There's not even an algorithm that is providing the answer. Okay, it's much more complicated than that. With a neural net of any sophistication, you can't point to the thing and say that's what we programmed in. Any more than you can point to a neuron in the brain and say that is responsible for this particular action. Not the way the brain works, and it's not the way these neural networks work. Anyway, a slight aside. Right, and that I'm going to call that it for a Sunday.